All right. Wow, good morning, y'all. Good to see you. Well, it blesses my heart to see you here today. Welcome. My name is Troy. I'm one of the pastors, and just grateful that you chose to spend this special occasion with us. We're honored, and I hope this encourages you today. Beautiful day out there. You notice the trees are starting to get some leaves up on the mountain there. But it snowed this week. Man, who saw that coming? Well, I did. Every Easter it snows here in Steamboat, even if it looks like it's been summer, but great week. I want to just give a quick shout out to all of our volunteers that helped out with the big egg hunt downtown yesterday. The largest attended egg hunt we've ever had. So many kids had a great time. Thank you for the 100 plus volunteers that did a part of that. Give them a big hand if you would. Appreciate you doing that, making some kids' day for that. And so I'm going to make a confession to you here real quick, and none of you are going to be surprised by it, but I'll tell you it anyway. I love Easter. I mean, I do. I didn't grow up in this, so this is, relatively new for me, but I love Easter, and even though every one of you knows what I'm going to talk about today, I love it, because here's why. We are celebrating the resurrection of Jesus. That's what this is all about. We're celebrating something incredible, and even though it's obvious, I love it. But here's the thing: what might not be obvious to you is that Easter. Don't miss this. Easter forces us to ask ourselves a very important question. Forces everyone to ask this question. I won't say that this is the most important question in the world because you might disagree, but it certainly is a question that everyone should ask at some point in their life. If you've never asked this question before, or maybe you haven't asked this question since you were a child, you should ask it today because Easter points us to the answer of this very important question, which is, who is Jesus? Who is he really? Who was he? Who is Jesus? And here's the thing that I just want to say at the beginning. The resurrection convinced Jesus' first century followers that he was, in fact, the Jewish Messiah, that he was the Son of God, or how we might say he was God in a bod. That's what it was. It wasn't his teaching that convinced them. Even though his teaching was great, it wasn't his teaching that convinced them. It wasn't his tricks or his miracles, depending on how you want to interpret those things, that convinced them. It was the resurrection that convinced them. That's what caused them to cross the line and never go back. And it's been convincing people ever since. Now, if you're here for the first time, you're with us, again, welcome. Or if you're watching online, here's something that you do need to know about us. And this might be cool. We don't believe that Jesus rose from the dead because the Bible tells us so. It is way, way better than that. It is so much better than that. We believe that Jesus rose from the dead because, number one, a first century Jewish tax collector by the name of Matthew followed Jesus for 3 years, and then he wrote down what he saw in Jesus' life and his death and his resurrection. And that document has survived. We believe because a Greek man by the name of Mark, who, by the way, was friends with Peter the fisherman, the famous fisherman from Galilee, he wrote down Peter's eyewitness account that Jesus rose from the dead. And again, that document has existed. We believe that Jesus rose from the dead because a first century physician, a doctor by the name of Luke, traveled all over Judea interviewing many, many people who saw Jesus alive after the crucifixion. And then Luke, get this, he wrote a letter to his friend named Theophilus, and he told him everything that he had learned. And that letter has now become known as the Gospel of Luke. And we believe because the Apostle Paul, who, I love this one, this guy steps on to the pages of history as a Jewish terrorist against Christians and against Christianity. He spent many years of his life chasing down, beating up, arresting, and even putting Christians to death because he was against all this. And then later on in his life, he became convinced that Jesus was the Messiah. And he gave his life. Paul gave his life literally for preaching that the resurrection of Jesus actually happened. And so we believe, because these brave men documented what they saw and what they heard and about the resurrection. And long after their accounts, their eyewitness accounts had been circulated all over Asia and all over Europe and the Mediterranean, these then documents were then collected and they were put into one book that eventually became known as the Bible. In other words, we believe that the eyewitness accounts came first, before the Bible. In other words, there wouldn't be no Bible if there wasn't these eyewitness accounts. And that's why we believe. Also, one of the reasons that we take their accounts seriously is that they don't write themselves into the story as heroes, which is fascinating. I'm a historian. History has a saying that history is written by the winners. Well, in this case, history was written by the losers, and they admit that freely. They are excruciatingly honest about their failures and their shortcomings, and they admit that they were doubters. They don't act like they were faithful the whole time, that they were flaky. They admit that. They admit that they were unbelievers. Why? Because they, in fact, disbelieved and unbelieved in Jesus after he was crucified. There were no Christians after the crucifixion there. Everybody bailed. There were no followers of Jesus. And after the crucifixion, these guys fully expected Jesus to do what all dead bodies do. Stay dead. That's what they thought. Nobody was standing outside the tomb on that very first Easter morning waiting for Jesus to come out. No one was there. No one was standing there counting backwards from 10, 9, 8, 7, cue the sunrise, 6, 5, 4, 3, roll the stone away, 2. Nobody was there because nobody expected no body. That was a surprise to everybody. I mean, all of these guys and people had followed him. They were convinced at this point that they had been misled and even lied to by Jesus. And the problem, you see, with Jesus is that it wasn't what he did or what he taught. Everybody was cool with that. That was all good. The problem with Jesus is what he claimed about himself. He claimed to be the Son of God. That puts you in an insane asylum today. But he claimed to be the Son of God. And they knew that you can't kill God. You can't kill the Son of God. And so, like us, those people, all those guys, those people, they all genuinely wrestled with this question, who is Jesus? Who is he really? And here's the thing, the resurrection answered that question once and for all for them. Once they saw that, they never wavered again, to the detriment of their own lives even. Now, over the last few weeks, if you've been with us, we've been reading through another account of Jesus' life. It was written by a guy by the name of John. And the Apostle John was a young man, and he began following Jesus when he was young. And he followed Jesus for 3 years of his life. And he was a witness to all that Jesus did. And he was a witness to the crucifixion and the resurrection. And like the others who followed Jesus, he didn't expect either one of those things. He didn't see those coming. He expected a king. He expected Jesus to be king. In fact, we talked about this last week. After Jesus raised his friend Lazarus from the dead, after Lazarus had been dead 4 days, many people believed. Many people got excited about this. Many people believed that Jesus was then going to kick Rome out and declare himself as the next great king of Israel. The problem was that it was too many. Too many people were believing, and this threatened the powers that be. In fact, as Jesus came over the hill from Bethany into Jerusalem that last week, the whole city showed up and met him on the Mount of Olives. And thousands of people welcomed him as they sang songs to him and waved palm branches, declaring him their new king. And coincidentally, the Jewish Passover was just a few days after this. And this is the time when Jews would celebrate the time in history when God, you might remember, delivered Israel out of bondage from Egypt. Remember that? Well, many of these people showed up. They fully expected Jesus to deliver Israel out of bondage from Rome. And so this was a highly politicized situation, and Jesus' enemies who felt threatened by this, they made plans immediately to arrest Jesus and to kill him while he was in Jerusalem that week. And spies that were even within Jesus' crew made a deal to betray him and to give him up on the night of the Passover. And so a couple days later, as Jesus celebrated the Passover meal with his 12 disciples, he makes an announcement. I don't know if you ever caught this. This is brilliant. He makes an announcement. He tells his disciples that God was making a new covenant, a new deal, a new contract with mankind. And this covenant wasn't just going to be for Israel. It was going to be for the whole world. And Jesus said that this new covenant was unconditional. In other words, it was only on him. It had nothing to do with us and what we could do. He said that this covenant would be established in his blood, which nobody really understood when he said that and what he meant. But he said this new covenant, it's interesting, would have one new commandment attached to it. You might remember the old covenant had 10 commandments, and they eventually evolved into hundreds and hundreds of laws, and it made everything complicated and funky for the Jewish society to live in that. But Jesus said that this new commandment was very simple, and it was very clear. Everybody could understand it. He said, get this, that his followers would have to love one another and love others just as Jesus loved them. That was the one commandment. I want you to love each other as I've loved you. And what was interesting about this is that Jesus' love now would be the new earmark, the new trademark of this new movement that he created. In other words, if you were to identify with him and with it, you were one of those people, it would be clear that this was the sign. It wasn't that you carried around a big giant black Bible everywhere you went, or you had a nice little cross hanging around your neck. The sign that you were part of this, that you were part of Jesus, is that you loved other people sacrificially and without prejudice and extremely. You loved them well. And over the next few days, Jesus gave a demonstration of his love for them and for the world that would literally take their breath away. And so after this meal that Jesus has with them, he leads his friends across the valley over to the Garden of Gethsemane to pray. You might remember this. And it was there that Jesus was betrayed, and then he was then arrested, and then he was taken, and he was ordered to be beaten by the high priest of Jerusalem. And John says that right after that, he was then taken to Pilate, who was the Roman governor, because the Jews knew that they couldn't do anything without permission from Pilate. And so they made some accusations against Jesus, and Pilate found no evidence to charge Jesus, but he had him whipped anyway, because he hoped that that would kind of satisfy the religious leaders. It didn't. It was not enough. The religious leaders said this. They said, this man must die because he claims to be the Son of God. This is offensive. This is blasphemous, and he needs to die. Pilate was like, who cares? I don't care about that. That doesn't bother me. And they're like, well, Pilate, here's something else. He also claims to be king. Remember, everybody was saying he's a king? And so Pilate, if you're a friend of Caesar, you can't be friends with this man. And Pilate's convinced, and he relents, and then he orders Jesus to be crucified. And John saw all of this, and he wrote it down. And in John chapter 19, he tells us what happens next. He says, so then the soldiers took charge of Jesus, carrying his own cross. He went out to the place of the skull, which is a hill that looks like a human skull. I've been there. It is fascinating. And it says this, and there they crucified him with two others, one on each side with Jesus in the middle. John doesn't give us any more details than that, because no other details are really necessary. Anybody who lived in the first century or the second century or the third century, they had seen a crucifixion. There were many of them, and they knew the aftermath of that. They knew what it looked like. They knew how brutal it was. And so he doesn't tell us more. But John does give us a detail that would be unnecessary for him to give unless it was true. It's fascinating. John says that as he stood next to Mary, the mother of Jesus, gazing up at Jesus as he was hanging on the cross, that Jesus then looked down and said this to John. He said this, he said, behold your mother. This is a private conversation. Jesus is telling John, this is Jesus telling John, Jesus' way of saying, John, would you take care of my mom? And then John tells us that soon after that, Jesus uttered his last words. John 19:30, it says, Jesus said, "It is finished." And then he bowed his head and he died. Now, what John writes next is interesting. Most people, when they read this narrative, they kind of skip over this without thinking much about what's being said, because the words don't seem like they have much meaning. They're not adding to the story, right? But in fact, they're incredibly important for you and I. Listen to this. John pauses his story about Jesus to make this statement. And I don't think it's necessarily for his immediate audience. I think it is for all the future generations of people like you and me who would read this account 1,000 years later and wonder, is this a fairy tale? I mean, does this really happen? I think this is why he wrote it. John, in verse 35, talking about himself in the third person, says this. He says, the man who saw this is giving you an accurate account. He speaks the truth, and he testifies that this is true so that you might believe. He's putting a stamp on this. It's as if John is kind of reaching out through history, and he's grabbing you and I by the shoulders, and he's like looking us in the eye, and he's saying, listen, I swear to you, what I'm saying here is true. This really happened. Trust me. To which you and I might say, okay, I mean, so far so good. I mean, so far all you've told us, John, is about this wannabe Messiah guy who got crucified by Rome. There's nothing unbelievable about that. That happened a lot. Many thousands of people were crucified, and many of those people were Jewish, and some of those people were Jewish people who claimed to be the next Messiah, and Rome was going like, no more trouble, and they just put these people out of their misery. So there's nothing unbelievable about that, to which John would say, no, not that part. The next part. What happens next is what you're going to have a hard time believing. But I promise you, I swear to you that my testimony is true. Hear me when I say this. And then John goes back to a story and he tells us what happens next. In verse 38, he says later, in other words, after Jesus had been crucified and was dead, Joseph of Arimathea. John gives us a very specific name. It's as if he's saying, listen, if you don't believe what I'm saying, go ask Joe. He'll tell you. I tell him. And then he says, Joseph of Arimathea asked Pilate for the body of Jesus, to take the body off of the cross. And so with Pilate's permission, Joe came and he took the body down and he took the body away. Now you might ask, why did he need to ask permission? Well, because back then you could not bury a crucified body unless you had bribed someone. Because the body was the possession of the state. Anybody that got crucified was a stain on Rome. They were a criminal. They wanted to just eradicate their memory. They wanted them out. It was a bad way to die, as you can imagine. Painful, and they wanted to warn everybody, and they were a stain, and so you just couldn't, take that body. They didn't want families to come and take the body and do a memorial and celebrate the life and make him a martyr. No, crucified bodies were to be taken to the dump and burned or consumed by wild animals. That was what you did with them. And so he bribed Pilate to take the body. In verse 39, it says this. John says that he was accompanied by a guy by the name of Nicodemus, the same man who had earlier came and visited Jesus at night secretly, which, again, here's John naming names. He's naming names. And this is a big name. This is a Pharisee. If you remember, the Pharisees were the guys that were against Jesus, and Nicodemus apparently was an admirer of Jesus. He came to Jesus late at night and secretly had this conversation, and he shows up here at the end to want to take care of his body. And in fact, John says that Nicodemus brought some stuff. He brought a mixture of myrrh and aloes, about 75 pounds worth. That's very expensive. And you might go, what's that for? Well, they were wanting to embalm the body. And you're like, why would they do that? Well, because they expected Jesus' body to do what dead bodies do. Stay dead. And so in verse 40, it says this, that taking Jesus' body, down. The two of them then wrapped it with the spices and strips of linen. Very meticulous. It's almost like they were mummifying this body. And then they did this in accordance with Jewish burial traditions. Then they say this: at the place where Jesus happened to be crucified, there was a garden nearby. And in the garden, there was a new tomb, or a cave, in which no one had ever been laid before. Many people believe that this was Joseph's tomb that he had bought. He was a wealthy man, and that he had bought this for himself and his family, but he gives it to Jesus. Verse 42, though, it says this: but it was a Jewish day of preparation, and since the tomb was nearby, they laid Jesus' body in there. This is John's way of saying that they were in a hurry. They were in a hurry. Why were they in a hurry? Well, because once the sun set on Friday night, the Sabbath would then begin. And none of this work that they were doing would have been lawful after the Sabbath started. And so they quickly wrapped his body up, put his body in a tomb, and then had their slaves roll a big old stone in front of it. And then they bailed. They got out of there. They left. And they, like almost everyone else that was a part of this, Peter and John and the other disciples, they just disappeared into the city, hiding out because they were with Jesus and they were afraid they were next. They went into the countryside, and we're not really told. This is interesting. We don't really know what they did that night, or what they did the next day on Saturday, or what they did Saturday night. I have a feeling that they might have gathered together in little groups and maybe talked. Maybe kind of discussed. I mean, they might have talked about what a waste of time the last 3 years of their life was, right? I mean, Jesus got arrested and crucified so quickly, they didn't really have time to catch up emotionally to what was happening. And there's no doubt that they were deeply heartbroken about their friend's gruesome and painful death. But I also think that they were upset and that they were disappointed. And they're probably a little angry about how this thing ended for them. But then John tells us that that Sunday morning, they were awakened to someone banging on their door. Now, their first thought was, oh man, the soldiers have come to get us. But then they realized, oh yeah, Roman soldiers don't knock. They just kick the door in, right? They just come in on their own. But so when they get to the door, they open it up. They find Mary Magdalene from way back, standing there amongst them. Mary was one of Jesus' most devoted followers. Jesus had done a miracle for her many years before, and she was one of the many, many women who were his followers and his disciples as well. And in fact, Jesus, if you don't know this, ladies, Jesus consistently elevated the dignity and the value of women in this culture that did not treat them well. Rome didn't, and neither did Israel. And Jesus also elevated, by the way, the value and the dignity of children. Because back then, children would just be discarded. No one would take care of them. It was an interesting thing. And more than that, let's just admit it. Jesus elevated the dignity and the value of everyone. I mean, everybody felt better around him. He could see the goodness in everybody. And so, but anyway, Mary's standing at the door and she's sobbing, and they could barely understand what she's trying to tell them. And in verse 2, John tells us that, Peter and John finally get this out of her, that she says this: they have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we don't know where they put him. And we don't know who they is. She doesn't say who they is, but she's inferring thieves. Grave robbers have come and stolen the body. And this was concerning to the guys a little bit. And so John tells us in verse 3, one of my favorite verses in the Bible. I love it. It says this: so Peter and the other disciple, John is speaking about himself. Peter and the other disciple started for the tomb. Both were running, but the other disciple, talking about himself, outran Peter and reached the tomb first. Which is funny, and you wonder why you write that, because I think it's what happened. And secondly, I have a theory why he did put this in there. By the time that John wrote this, many years later, he was one of the last disciples to be alive. When he wrote this, Peter had already been executed in Rome many years previous, been crucified upside down. And I think that John, as he remembered this incident, chuckled to himself and thought, Peter's not here to defend himself. And I think by now, Peter wouldn't be embarrassed by this detail, so people should know. I outran him to the tomb. I'm faster than Peter. And then John kind of pauses and he realizes, oh, if I tell that part of the story, I got to tell the whole story. And so then John says this on himself. He says, when I got there, I bent over and I looked in at the strips of linen that were lying in there, but I did not go in. Why? Because it was dark. It was a tomb. It's creepy. I mean, I'm telling you, these guys don't write themselves as courageous heroes who were brave and had faith in God and no worries. They were confused. And they were afraid that first Easter morning. And I just love their honesty. It makes me believe this more. Anyway, in verse 6, he then says something else that's honest. He says, then Simon Peter finally showed up, came behind him, and he goes straight into the tomb. Why? Because this is something that Peter would do, right? I mean, that's totally Peter. Peter didn't wait to act. He didn't wait to talk. He didn't wait to put his foot in his mouth. He was just impulsive, right? And so he goes right in, and here's what happens. John says, this is interesting, that they saw the strangest thing. It may not seem strange to us, but it was strange to them what they saw in the tomb. He says he saw the strips of linen lying there, as well as the cloth that had been wrapped around Jesus' head. He said it's interesting, the cloth was still lying in its place, separate from the linen. In other words, this wasn't a rush job. Thieves would not have taken the time to disembalm or unembalm the body. If they broke into that, they just would have taken the body as is and bolted and gotten out of there. And then John says this in verse 8. He says, finally, the other disciple, the one who reached the tomb first, in case you forgot, I beat Peter. He then went inside. He had the courage to finally go inside. And when he gets inside, something happens to him. And John, in this moment, gives us the formula. This formula that we see all throughout his gospel. We've talked about this before. It's a formula that we see all throughout the gospels. And this formula, don't miss this, this formula is the key to finding faith. It's important for some of you. Some of you have never really found faith. You're here because you got invited to go and you're nice and you're polite and they promised you brunch afterwards. Hurry it up. I get it. But you've just looked at your family that has faith and you're like, I don't know how you do it. I don't know how you believe. Or maybe you, like a lot of people, used to have faith, a lot of faith as a kid, but you've lost that faith. This formula that he gives us is the key to finding faith again. In spite of what you were told as a kid when you were in Sunday school class and you asked a hard question and the teacher's like, it didn't really answer you, or you had doubts and you went to your parents and like, I really don't know if I believe. Your parents might have told you, your teacher might have told you this. You just got to believe. You just gotta have faith. Like conjure it up, just do it, you know. And the gospel writers would say no. They would say that seeing is believing, because it is. Right? Seeing is believing. That's the formula. That's how you believe. You see and you believe, right? And so I tell you, as John went inside this empty tomb, here's what it says in verse 8. He says, he saw and he believed. He saw things that made him go, OMG, right? Standing in this empty tomb, it suddenly occurred to John that everything Jesus said was true. Jesus had predicted this, and he had forgotten. He's like, oh, right? I mean, everything that Jesus said about himself was true. Everything that Jesus said about the Father, right? Which, whatever you say, Jesus, but now they're realizing it's true. In fact, I bet you John might have remembered this weird conversation that took place between Philip and Jesus at the Passover meal just a few days before. Philip turned to Jesus and he said, Jesus, would you just show us the Father? You keep talking about him, that he's everywhere and it's obvious. Would you just show us the Father? And Jesus looked at him and he looked at the other disciples and he said, anyone who has seen me, seen the Father. I mean, it's weird, but he's not saying, look, this is how God looks like. He was saying, this is the heart of God. If you've seen my temperament and if you've seen my approach and my love, this is, in other words, I'm as close to understanding God as you're going to ever see. If you can look at me and get it. And so as John stood there in that tomb empty, John realizes something, and I'll just say it out loud. This is what he realizes. Jesus is God. It's weird to say. This man is God. And he's like, Jesus did and said things only God would say and do, right? Jesus cared for and loved people like no one ever cared for or loved people before. Jesus lifted people up. He encouraged people. He gave dignity to those who were outcasts, who had been left behind, who were disenfranchised and disempowered. Gosh, Jesus even invited nasty, traitorous tax collectors to be part of his inner circle and to follow him. Jesus invited drunkards and prostitutes and irreligious people to be his friend. And suddenly it all made sense to John that everything Jesus said was true. In fact, when Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead just a week before, Jesus said these words. He said this. He said, I am the resurrection and the life. In other words, the resurrection isn't an event that's going to happen someday. The resurrection is a person. Everywhere I go, I bring life to things that have died. I bring healing to things that are sick. Why? I am the creator of life. All I can do is bring life. And everywhere I go, there's life. And John's standing there and he's like, oh my gosh, I don't know where Jesus is right now, but I know this. He ain't dead. He's alive. He's alive. In fact, over the next few weeks, John and hundreds of other people saw Jesus alive, personally. Testimonies, people. John records several of these incidents, and I would love to read them all to you. But before I close, I want to read one of them that I think is particularly important and might connect with some of you. Now, remember this. When Jesus was crucified, everyone knew it was over. They knew he was gone. He was dead as a doornail. It was over. Jesus was dead, and this movement was dead along with him. Whatever he had been trying to start was over. This isn't like other movements, you know. You guys know other movements where, the leader gets assassinated or he dies, and then his people are like, let's keep the dream alive. Let's remember his teachings and share them with one another. There was no teaching to keep alive in this instance because Jesus' teaching was mostly about himself. Like I said, he taught that he was the Son of God. And now that he was dead, that clearly wasn't true, and his followers knew that it was over and they needed to move on, and they quit. They bailed. They left. Peter and John, they kind of hid out somewhere in the city. The other disciples, some of them went over the hill back to Bethany where Lazarus was to hide, and other disciples just kind of disappeared. Vanished off of everybody's scene. In fact, one of those that did that was a guy by the name of Thomas. And John says that when Jesus began to appear and to meet with his disciples, some of them were still missing. Some of them are still gone. In verse 24, it says this, now Thomas, one of the 12, was not with the disciples when Jesus showed up. And the other disciples, they ran into Thomas and they're like, hey, dude, guess what? No, we saw Jesus alive. He's alive, man. We have seen the Lord. Now, Thomas wasn't stupid, and he wasn't superstitious. And he was a little disappointed. He just spent the last 3 years of his life following a fake Messiah. And so Thomas wasn't interested in wasting any more time talking about or chasing ghost stories. And so Thomas tells him what you and I would have said. He's like, hey, unless I see the nail marks in his hands, yea, unless I can put my finger in there where the nails were and put my hand in his side where the guard pierced him with the spear, remember that? I will not believe. Thank you. I won't do it. John, Peter, I love you guys, but I think you're hallucinating. The rest of you guys, I love you, but I'm not going to spend the rest of my life following this dead man who came back to life unless I see him with my own two eyes. And who could blame him? Who would blame him for this? Thomas needed proof to believe. Just like you. Just like all of us. We all need proof. And so God gave it to him. In verse 26, it says this. John says, a week later, his disciples were in a house again, and Thomas was with them. And John would say to us, if he was telling the story right now, he'd say, listen, hold on. I know what I'm about to say next is going to seem odd. It's going to seem strange to you, but I'm telling you, this is what happened. I can't soft sell it. It's what happened, and my testimony is true. My testimony is true. And in fact, I've suffered a lot in my life for telling people what I saw. But believe me, this is really what happened. Verse 26, John says this. He says, even though the doors to the house were locked, Jesus came and stood among us. Jesus, who was dead on that cross, bloody mess, organs exposed, he came and he stood among us. And then he said, shalom, peace, because we were scared to death, and he knew it. We couldn't believe this. And then he said, John asked Thomas this. He said, Tom, do you see my hands? You want to look at my hands? Put your finger right here. And reach out your hand and put it right here in my side where the soldier pierced me. It's me, Thomas. It's not a ghost. I'm alive. And then Jesus says something to Thomas, and the translation, the English translation, is really funky. He says this, but it kind of makes a point. He says, Thomas, do not be unbelieving, but believe. He's like, get out of this camp that you're stuck in. Cross the line. I know you're stuck in this unbelief, but you need to believe what you're seeing right now. And Thomas was instantly convinced. He said to Jesus, my Lord, my God, it's you. You're alive. It's you. I believe. And then Jesus says this to him. He says, blessed, he said, because you have seen me, Thomas, you have believed. Because seeing is believing, right? I get why you doubted, and I get why you couldn't believe, because this is hard, I understand. And by the way, Thomas, you're just like the rest of these guys. Don't let them fool you. Don't let them give you the nickname Doubting Thomas, because every single one of these guys doubted it too, until they saw the empty tomb, until they saw me, because seeing is believing. So because you have seen me, you have believed. And then Jesus says something incredible, and I love this. It's for us. It's as if Jesus knows that this story would be repeated and repeated for generations and generations. Jesus looks into the future, 2,000 years, and he looks at you. And he looks at you, and he looks at me, and he smiles, and he says this. He says, but blessed are those who have not seen and yet still believed. Blessed are those who haven't seen, but have still believed. In other words, blessed are those who believe because of the testimony that John wrote, or Matthew wrote, or Luke wrote, or Mark wrote, or Peter wrote, or Paul wrote. Blessed are those who believe what these guys saw and then wrote to us. And so then John kind of closes his whole little story with an invitation to every one of us. And it's as John is saying, listen, I want to invite you to believe what I now believe. I want to invite you to do it. It's okay. You're on good, solid ground. I want you to believe what I believe. And here's how he says it in verse 30. And I'll close. He says this. John says that Jesus performed many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not recorded in this document, because there's a lot more. And room wouldn't allow everything. But, he says, these have been written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, that he is the Son of God, And that by believing in him, you may experience an extraordinary life just like I have. You experience amazing things just like I have in his name. I think if John was here today, he would say to you and I, he would say, listen, if you want to live a life that's a little more extraordinary, you want to live a life of purpose, of significance, more than just for this world, for something that might have real significance. If you want to live a life that has peace, like even though the world is crazy and falling around you, you go, I know how this is going to end, you'll be fine. If you want to live a life of joy, not just happiness, like you might have been happy last night, but today not so much, but a joy that just kind of rolls with you, that you're like, it's all good in the neighborhood. You want that joy? Here's what all you need to do, John would say, don't miss this, believe what I've told you and never forget it. You see, seeing made a believer out of me. And believing in Jesus changed my life. And I promise it'll change yours. And then he would say, oh, by the way, I love Easter too, Pastor Troy. I love it. Amen? Let me pray for you. We'll close. John, earlier in his gospel, in chapter 3, verse 16, wrote these words. He said, for God so loved the world. For God so loved you and me, he gave his only son, that whoever would believe, there it is again, that word, right? That whoever would just believe in him and trust in him, that they would not perish, but that they would receive eternal, wonderful, perpetual life. In other words, Jesus could not make this thing any easier for us. He said, I just want you to simply believe. And if you will believe, then you will see too, right? Jesus said, if you seek me, you will find me. If you'll step and pursue, you'll see what you may have not seen before. I will show myself to you. And so this is amazing. This is the good news that you and I have been offered here today. And I just pray that God, you would help us all to believe, to help us to believe, and to help those of us who maybe have lost our faith, just like the disciples did, that you would help us to believe again and to never stop believing. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.